2007 was arguably one of the best years that anime has had in a long time. At least for a fan like me, because there were just so many good shows from that year. We were spoiled for choice when most years before and in the years since we've been lucky to maybe get only a small handful, probably only 2, maybe 3 really good shows. As such, it's not terribly surprising that in a year full of so many good anime, that a show that in any other year would have been highlighted as really, really great got slightly pushed to the side. Everyone has seen or at least heard of an anime called Gurren Lagann, but I don't think the same can be said for Moribito. Moribito is one of those shows that I bought like a while back, but until around now, never actually watched it. Not because I didn't want to watch it, but because I had already suspected that I was going to really enjoy it, so I kinda pushed it aside for a time when I knew that I would need something really good to watch. And that time, apparently, was today. Ladies, gentlemen, and others, my name is Arcada, and welcome to Glass Reflection. Today, the 2007 anime from Production IG, Moribito, the Guardian of the Spirit. Let's jam! The story of Moribito is actually quite simple because it likes to tie itself down to what most watchers will perceive as a kind of version of reality. Feudal-era Japan. The Emperor's son is under constant threat from assassination, and not by some rival clan or evil entity, but by his own father. This is due to a prophecy and superstitious belief that he has been possessed by some demon, and since the Emperor's family is supposed to be seen by the masses as holy and incorruptible, it is decided to have him assassinated. In the prince's camp, however, is his mother, who sends out her closest advisors to find a warrior of great strength to take her son away from the palace and protect him until either the prophecy has been proven false, the demon, and yes, there actually is a demon inside him, gets removed, or neither, and he just stays away from the palace forever to live a normal life, and the royal family will continue without him, believing him to be dead. The queen's advisors eventually get into contact with a spearwoman mercenary named Balsa, who on top of being a skillful warrior was also responsible for saving the young prince from one previous assassination attempt, involving him nearly drowning in the local river. They bring Balsa politely, yet forcefully, to the palace to meet with the queen, who hires her to protect the prince. Balsa agrees, and she and Chagum leave the palace as it goes up in smoke to give the appearance that the princess died in a fire. Roughly from that point, we get their adventures as Balsa tries to keep Chagum alive. And when sections of the Emperor's advisors realize that he is in fact alive and didn't die in a fire, they give chase. Now, before I even started watching this series, and admittedly still during the first few episodes, I was under an assumption that you might even be under right now, based on the very small amount of information I've given to you. That assumption being that from this point on, the majority of episodes are going to be about Chagum and Balsa traveling around their world, trying to dodge and avoid assassinations and so forth, while also, you know, doing a shit ton of world building out and about. Turns out, my assumption was completely false, as Balsa decides to take the much more strategically advantageous yet extremely risky avenue of not actually going anywhere, but actually staying within like almost view distance of the palace. And this is kind of a gamble because you have to hope that no one would expect them to still be hiding out in the city. A lot of this confidence and strategy also helps us to see exactly what kind of person Balsa is as a character. Like on the outset, considering her form, ability, and the fact that the show was produced by Production IG, comparisons between her and Major Motoko Kusanagi from Ghost in the Shell are inevitable. But, and this is where my Ghost in the Shell fanboy gets to come out, considering that the Major was supposed to be designed as a perfect woman, she is a cyborg in a mass-produced female body so that she can blend in. By comparison, Balsa comes off a lot less perfect and a lot more rugged and toned. She actually reminds me a lot of Sarah Connor from Terminator 2, especially since Balsa's in her 30s, which for an anime is almost unheard of. Yes, she is beautiful, but not in any traditional way. And she definitely is not like the standard female characters that you see in other anime with fantasy settings. Lodos, Slayers, Sacred Blacksmith, Tears to Terra, even the MMO fantasy series like SAO and Log Horizon don't have a female character like Balsa. And this change from the norm is not limited to Balsa either. Chalgum is admittedly a pampered prince at the beginning, but when thrust into the world without servants or people to cater to his every whim, he grounds himself quite quickly. He doesn't whine or bemoan his new circumstances. He doesn't see himself as above the riffraff of the common people. The most he is ever disappointed in, understandably, is the separation between him and his family, which is admirable considering that he holds that disappointment and desire to be with them again, even considering that several of his family, his father in particular, want him dead. But they don't really want him dead, and that's kind of the thing. The series shows that the Emperor is, in fact, a little bit torn over the fact that he ordered the death of his son. And everybody seems to be doing what they're doing because they believe that the demon inside Chalgum will cause death and despair to all the land. And as such, the show doesn't really have an antagonist. There's conflict. Oh boy, is there conflict, and it's beautifully animated. I'll get to that. But there is no demon king. There is no ultimate evil. If anything, the antagonist of this show is the unknown. Or rather, everyone's fears of the unknown. And this isn't a bad way to go, all told, but it ends up lacking this kind of sense of urgency. It's almost like the threat that faces all the land doesn't actually seem to be that great, because it's not pushed forward by a main antagonist. Two last things story-wise. First is that the show likes to meander. While entertaining and enlightening, the show's middle episodes tend to lose sight of the show's ending, taking side paths here and there that just delay it from getting to that ending that it said it was heading towards. Now, on the 8th disc of the DVD set, there is a discussion between the show's director, Kenji Kamiyama, and the original author, Nahoko Uehashi. And that discussion kind of explains this. Apparently, the existing story that they had was only enough to fill about maybe 13 to 15 episodes. So rather than lengthen that story and stretch it into the 26 episodes that the show became, they decided to instead leave the story as it is, but just add to it. Honestly, I didn't feel like the additions were necessarily horrible, but it did feel like padding. To bring in another comparison with Ghost in the Shell, there's so many of those, I know. It feels very similar to what Kamiyama did with Standalone Complex. Have the main story only about 13 episodes, which are the complex episodes, and the rest of them just be padding world-building filler. Those were the standalone episodes. And that format worked really well for Ghost in the Shell. I don't feel like it did as well for Moribito. This is slightly made up by the one last thing that I want to mention, and that is the show's ending. Now, without spoiling anything, the ending to Moribito does have a sense of closure to it. Far more than I expected anyway. Now, yes, there is smatterings of a sequel hook in there, and at this point we're not going to get one, but it did actually end, and it was satisfying to watch, which, as you may know of the stuff that I end up watching, that's a rarity. So it had an ending, and I liked it a lot. Now, as you hopefully have seen by this point, the animation for Moribito is quite stellar. It has now been about 9 years from when the series aired until now, where I'm standing in this room like an insane, lonely person talking to a pitch-black camera that reflects the possible emptiness of my soul in its lens. And I will say that, quite honestly, if this was the quality of animation that we got out of something that came out today, I would still be impressed. With exception, of course, to some of the times that 3D animation is integrated with 2D. A lot of the times this happens, it doesn't actually look that good. And I'm not even sure exactly why they did it, besides the usual reasonings of saving time and or money. Now, there are times where it does its job, which is to just be there and not really be noticeable, but it was not always that way. And it made it kind of jarring at times. The 2D animation, though, was really, really good. Particular note goes to the action scenes, which, rather than attempt to describe, have a watch. There is a level of aesthetic and quality on display here that is easy to lose yourself in. The beauty of this world can be so breathtaking that the major disappointment of it all is how the series doesn't maintain that quality beyond the first 5 or 6 episodes. Yes, there is a noticeable decline after the series has done its best to get you hooked and invested. That said, however, I am never one to take amazing quality visuals for granted, and I'm not one to have expected that it kept that up for all 26 episodes. When it needs to look amazing, it does, and if that means that the lesser important scenes look less amazing and stellar, so be it. Musically, the soundtrack was done by another Kenji, famous for working for Production IG, Kenji Kawai. Kawai has been doing anime music for what feels like forever, going all the way back to his work on Ramno 1/2 and Maison Ikkoku, though he is far more famous for some of the collaborations that he's done with Japanese director Mamoru Oshii, like Patlabor, and that one cyberpunk film that has a name that I've said far too many times in this video. He's not new to fantasy either, doing his take on the original soundtrack for Fate Stay Night for the Dean adaptation only a year before this. And if I had to say any one thing positive about him, I would say that he is very unique. His work is very good at standing alone. Oh god, what am I doing? And the same is true here. The music for Moribito can stand on its own, but when it is combined with the story, character, and animation of the show, it just produces magic. Now, about the dub. Overall, it actually wasn't too shabby, especially considering that most of the Bang Zoom dubs that I've listened to can be rather hit or miss. Special praise goes to Cindy Robinson for Balsa and Barbara Goodson as Madame Toragai. Both were brilliant, so bravo to them, and bravo to whoever casted them. If I had to point out a negative point, and this point, I will admit, is not so much of a negative, but just not necessarily a positive, and that was with Mona Marshall. Mona Marshall did Chagum, and with her performance, it was one of those things where, how best to explain this? You know how sometimes you're watching a dub, or you're watching something, and you hear a voice, and you're like, I know that voice, and then you identify it as, oh, that's so-and-so. Well, normally what happens to me in that is I have that, like, epiphany moment of, that's that person, and then shortly afterwards, as I am continually listening to this one character, I forget that it's that person, because I am only hearing the voice of the character, not the voice of the actor. Does that make sense? Well, with Chagum, it took a lot longer for me to actually physically forget that I was listening to Mona Marshall, because every time I heard Chagum speak, my mind was just like, hey, nudge, nudge, did you know that's Mona Marshall? And I'm like, yes, I know that's Mona Marshall. Can't really say how that could have been improved, because I'm not really an expert at this sort of thing, but it is something that happened, and as I said, it is not necessarily a negative, it's just not a positive. Okay? Okay. Now, I actually want to compare Moribito to another series kind of set in the same sort of era, and that's Mushishi. Both series, I find, are best savored, like a fine wine. Moribito does have action to it, but it's not a kind of action series that you can just watch mindlessly. It uses its action to get your adrenaline going, and the rest of the series just kind of lulls you into this nice, comfortable feeling as you're watching it. This nice, entertaining feeling. It is a fantasy series that very much should be placed on most people's top fantasy anime lists of all time. But it is not without its problems. It meanders. Its end goal is hard to visualize, let alone predict. And with exception to the main cast, it lets backstory enrich all of these secondary characters rather than the actions that they take in the now, which is something that wasn't so much frustrating to me as it was disappointing. As such, I present Moribito, Guardian of the Spirit, with a recommendation to buy it rather than stream. It is a superb fantasy series that does not rely on comedy or fan service to engage its audience, and it is not so full of high fantasy as to bore the casual watcher who might get interested from its rather superb visuals. You can pick it up on DVD from Viz Media for the low price of $13, like on places like Riot Stuff, which frankly should be illegal for something this good. Seriously. And at the time of this video, you can also go and stream it on Netflix and Hulu if you have access to those sites and you so choose. Ultimate anime recommendations go towards the heroic Legend of Arslan for a more recent take on fantasy anime, as well as the much-praised Sword of the Stranger for its similar setting as well as its astounding visuals. And hopefully between those you can find something to your liking. And that's it from me. Very special thanks to this month's patrons, Victor Ekmach, Joshua Garcia, Lulika Adachi, Nikolai Gray, and Grace Anderson for donating on my Patreon campaign. You are all seriously amazing. And until next time, ladies, gentlemen, and others, stay frosty.